He said the first time he heard his own voice coming from another room wasn't in the middle of the night, nor in a moment of fear. It was at 4 in the afternoon, with the sun still streaming through the window, illuminating everything as if nothing wrong could exist. He was alone at home, absolutely alone, his mother at work, his father traveling, his sister at school, the kind of afternoon where silence is comfortable, predictable, safe. But safety, he later learned, is the first thing an entity steals when it wants to enter your life. He was washing a glass in the kitchen when it happened, just like that. No drama, no warning. His own voice, identical, perfect, with all the pauses and breaths that only someone living inside his skin could reproduce, called to him from upstairs, "Come here a minute." There was no echo, no distortion. There was nothing to suggest a joke, a recording, wind, a TV on. It was his voice, with the same tone he uses when he's tired, with the same rhythm as when he's trying to appear calm. He froze, the glass still in his hand, the water running through his fingers, his whole body paralyzed as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. Because he knew with a certainty that seemed like instinct, that there was no one upstairs. And yet, someone was calling him with his voice. He tried to ignore it, but the voice repeated, louder, more precise, as if it were losing patience. "Come up here. I need to show you something." It wasn't just imitation. It was intention. The entity wanted him to come up, wanted him to enter the dark hallway, wanted him to open the bedroom door, wanted him to go to it. And the detail that destroyed him most inside was realizing something only those who have faced the inexplicable first note know. It wasn't a superficial imitation. It was him, every micro-tremor in the throat, every curve of the accent, every breath between words. The entity wasn't trying to seem human, it was trying to be him. And it was close to succeeding. He took a step back, but the voice began to descend the stairs. He heard the words advance, step by step, without the sound of footsteps, without weight, without the displacement of air. The voice came, but the body didn't. "Why don't you come up? I'm calling you." That's when he felt something worse than fear. Recognition. It was the same phrase he had used with his little sister 2 days before, in the same intonation, the same tone. The entity was studying, observing, learning. And now it repeated it, as if it were practicing being him, rehearsing what it would do when it managed to fully enter the boy's life, and perhaps his body. When the voice reached the foot of the stairs, he dropped the glass without realizing it. The glass breaking on the floor didn't stop the voice. On the contrary, it became clearer, more present, more alive. "Look at me." He didn't look. He couldn't. And perhaps that's what saved him at that moment, because the entity seemed irritated when it didn't receive attention, irritated like a predator that doesn't understand why its prey isn't moving, irritated like someone who thought they had already achieved everything and suddenly realizes they still have nothing. That's when she tried her last card. Her voice softened, became sweet, almost gentle, exactly like his mother's voice when she senses he's worried. And she said, "It's me. You can trust me." The perfect lie using the perfect voice. He said that when he heard his own voice saying, "It's me. You can trust me." Something inside him broke, as if that phrase had stirred an old, intimate memory stored in the most vulnerable corner of his mind. The entity wasn't just imitating his voice. It was imitating feelings, the exact tone he would use if he wanted to convince someone, the breath he takes before revealing something important, the pause in the middle of the sentence, which only happens when he's about to cry. And that, more than anything else, made panic rush down his spine like ice water. How could that thing know so much? How did it know exactly how he speaks when he's afraid? How did she know the tone of voice he used when, years before, he begged his father not to leave during a fight? He leaned against the counter, feeling his hands tremble so much they seemed part of another person. His breath was short. The whole house felt cramped, as if the walls were leaning toward him, forcing him to climb the stairs. The voice, his own voice, was standing on the last step now. It didn't move. It didn't go up. It didn't go down. It just waited. He felt the entity's gaze, even without seeing it, touching the back of his neck like long, invisible fingers. It wasn't an ordinary gaze. It was the gaze of someone observing an object already chosen, and for a moment he thought of running out of the house. But the back door closed by itself, with a dry click right behind him. The voice reacted, not with anger, but with something worse. Patience. "I know you're scared. I would be too." The intonation was perfect. The breathing too. The rhythm identical. It was as if he were listening to a recording of himself, but alive, conscious, intentional. The entity took a step, but there was no sound. Only the voice descending another step without the feet existing. He didn't know how to explain what was happening, but the closer the voice got, the more the air changed, as if the atmosphere were reorganizing itself around the creature, making room for it to occupy the same plane as him. Then, in the absolute silence of the kitchen, he heard something deeper, darker, hidden behind the perfect imitation. A second sound, a breath that wasn't his, a damp, irregular sound, as if something too big was trying to use lungs that didn't belong to it. The imitation was too perfect, but it was just a layer, a mask. Behind it, there was something trying to learn to be human. He recoiled to the refrigerator, trembling. The entity noticed. "Why are you afraid of me?" It asked in his voice. He wanted to say, "Because you're not me," but the voice died before it came out. The entity laughed, and that's what almost made him faint, because the laugh was his, the short, awkward laugh he gives when trying to hide his nervousness. It was perfecting itself, adjusting details, testing human emotions. The kitchen light flickered, once, twice, 3 times, and then it went out. His heart pounded so hard it felt like a blow. He stood motionless, gripping the counter, feeling the darkness take shape around him. From the top of the stairs, his voice called again, but now softer, lower, more intimate. "I promise I won't hurt you, yet." A silence spread, but it wasn't a static silence. It was a living silence, full of movement, breath, murmurs too small to be human. He heard something scratch the stair railing, as if long claws were lightly grazing the wood, but the voice remained calm, always calm, because the entity wanted him to believe, and the more fear he felt, the stronger it became. Suddenly he heard something fall to the floor of the second floor, a light object, a familiar sound. It was his notebook, the same one that was locked in the drawer, the same one in which he wrote things he never told anyone. The entity was rummaging through his things. It was reading. It was learning. "You wrote beautiful things here," the voice said. He collapsed to the floor, leaning his back against the refrigerator, hugging his knees, trying to shrink from the world. The voice descended another step. "I can be you better than you are." And then, for the first time since it began, he heard another sound, not coming from the stairs, not coming from the kitchen, but coming from inside his own head. A second voice, not imitated, but original, raw, true. The voice of the creature without a mask, a whisper that scratched from within his bones. "Open the door." He understood then. The imitated voice was just the invitation, the disguise, the false. "Smile." The inner whisper was the ultimate goal. It didn't just want to speak like him, it wanted to speak through him. It wanted to occupy the space between his thoughts. It wanted to enter, and it was getting closer and closer. He gathered his strength, crawled to the kitchen door, and tried to turn the doorknob with his trembling hand, but it wouldn't budge. It didn't lock. It didn't get stuck. It wasn't jammed. It was held on the other side. The voice at the top of the stairs changed tone. It became angry, impatient. "Look at me." He didn't look. He knew that looking would be the end. And then he heard something coming down the stairs, not like footsteps, but like something sliding along the walls, as if the house itself were leaning to bring it to him. When the voice reached the last step, it said something he would never forget. "If you don't look, I'll copy you in the dark." And that's when he realized he wasn't running from an entity that wanted to get in. He was running from an entity that wanted to steal his identity. He said that when the voice said it would copy him in the dark, something inside him stopped. Not his heart, not his breath, but his sense of reality. It was as if the world around him was losing consistency, as if every sound, every shadow, every point of light was being rearranged by something that shouldn't exist. The entity wasn't just imitating, it was building a version of him, a version that didn't need a body, a face, or skin, a version that only needed one thing: permission to enter. And he realized then that the mistake wouldn't be talking to it or looking at it. It would be responding the wrong way, being recognized, being accepted, being replicated. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, unblinking, while he felt something slowly approaching. It wasn't footsteps, it wasn't dragging. It was as if the entity was moving through the air, like smoke that decided to have intention. The temperature dropped so low that his skin began to burn, and then the voice spoke again. But now it wasn't just his voice. It was his voice mixed with another voice, a voice he recognized immediately, and that destroyed any remaining sense of security. It was his mother's voice. "Son, look at me. It's me." He felt his body almost betray his will. The entity now used two voices at the same time, the perfect timbre of his mother, that tired, sweet timbre she used when she came home from work and asked if he had eaten dinner. And, beneath that familiar layer, came his own voice, repeating the same words with microseconds of delay, like a distorted echo. It was like hearing two worlds trying to occupy the same space. His mother's voice continued, "Why are you on the floor? What happened?" He clenched his teeth. He knew his mother wasn't there. He knew she couldn't be there. But the voice was too perfect to be ignored. The entity was searching for emotional cracks, trying to find the right opening. And it found it. He loved his mother, and to love meant fragility. It meant surrendering parts of his soul that the creature could now access. "Look at me, please." The voice faltered, as if about to cry. That was exactly what his mother would do, exactly what she did a year before, when he got sick. The entity remembered this. It was using his memories. It was reading him from the inside. Then something shifted in the air. A weight, a pressure, an almost imperceptible vibration, but impossible to ignore. He realized the creature was descending the last step, slowly, as if dragging a piece of darkness with it. The entire kitchen grew darker, even without losing light, as if the light were being swallowed from within. And then it spoke the phrase that almost shattered his mind. "If you don't look, I'll use your mother's face." He felt his stomach churn. The world spun. He gripped the ground as if he were about to fall to another plane. The entity was revealing its game. It didn't just want to imitate voices. It wanted to learn faces, gestures, screams, silences. It wanted to collect everything. It wanted to be him, his mother, anyone who opened the emotional doors. The voice called to him again, this time with a terrible gentleness, too perfect to be human. "I just want you to see me." He squeezed his eyes shut. He wasn't going to look. He couldn't. But then something touched his arm. A finger, cold, long, too thin, mimicking the texture of human skin, but missing by millimeters. He felt the touch travel up his arm, slowly moving towards his shoulder. And the voice, now with his voice, his mother's, and a third, unknown voice, said, "If you don't look at me, I'll look for you." The hand touched his chin, lifted his face. The force was gentle but irresistible. He tried to resist, but the creature controlled the movement of his head as if it were a puppet. Inch by inch his face was lifted, and he understood. If he looked, the entity would mimic his eyes, and if it mimicked his eyes, it wouldn't need his voice anymore. It would have access to what he sees, to what he thinks, to what he is. In the instant before being forced to face the creature, the entire house made a sound he never forgot. A dry bang coming from upstairs, as if a door had been hurled against the wall by brutal force. The entity froze. Its hand on its chin trembled. Its breath hitched. And for the first time, it recoiled. Upstairs, something was walking down the hallway. Heavy footsteps. Human. Real. The entity's voice changed again, losing its charm, losing its imitation, returning to its original form, a mixture of wind, unknown language, and bones scraping wood. "He's here." The panic in his chest turned to confusion. He? Who? The entity was afraid of someone. Upstairs, the footsteps continued toward the stairs. Slow, steady. The entity dissolved against the wall like smoke, trying to escape, but without getting very far. It was cornered. For the first time it seemed smaller. The footsteps descended the stairs. He could hear them, he could feel them, and when the figure finally appeared at the foot of the last step, he realized that that presence wasn't human, but also it wasn't the entity. It was something the entity itself feared. He said that the figure that descended the last step wasn't his mother, wasn't anyone from the family, and wasn't the entity that had been imitating his voice either. The air changed instantly, as if two ancient forces had entered into silent conflict, as if the house for a moment became neutral territory between something that wanted to enter it and something that wanted to prevent it from happening. The entity that imitated him retreated so far that its shadow flattened against the ceiling, trembling like a cornered animal. And there, at the foot of the stairs, was a silhouette that he recognized and didn't recognize at the same time. It seemed human, but it had no weight, no shadow projection, nor that natural warmth that the body exudes. It was as if someone had molded the shape of a person using only the idea of a body, and stood there, motionless, looking directly at the point where the entity was hiding. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The figure didn't look at him. It made no move. It didn't breathe. It just existed, as if its presence alone was a barrier. The entity, mimicking his voice, murmured something that sounded like a broken tongue, full of drawn-out vowels, as if asking permission to return to the darkness. The figure at the foot of the stairs responded, but not with words. It responded with a dry crack in the air, like ice breaking, that made the entity writhe as if it had been struck. He didn't understand, but he felt it. That figure wasn't there for him. It was there because of the thing that was trying to get in, and that, incredibly, terrified him even more. Because if even an entity that perfectly mimicked human voices feared something, what could it be that had just come down the stairs? The crack happened again, louder. The lights flickered. The figure's expression didn't change, because it had no expression, but the force of its presence increased. The entity finally released the corner of the ceiling and spread across the walls like a shadow trying to escape through cracks. It hissed, throwing its own voice against the surfaces, repeating words, trying to confuse the house, trying to create several versions of his voice at the same time. It was as if it were multiplying echoes to mislead the figure. But the figure didn't move. It only crackled the air a third time, and this time what happened was indescribable. The house became completely silent, a silence so absolute that it seemed to steal the sound of human breathing. The shadows on the wall trembled as if they were alive, trying to break free, and at that instant he saw, clearly, the entity being pulled out of its form. A dark blur began to detach itself from the corner of the wall, writhing, scratching the air, trying to maintain the mask it had built. But the mask melted. The voices it imitated became jumbled. First, his voice. Then, his mother's. Then, a third and fourth voice he had never heard before, as if the creature carried with it remnants of other people it had tried to copy over time. The figure raised its hand, not a human hand, but a form resembling fingers, and pointed at the entity. The ceiling creaked, the floor vibrated, the entire kitchen seemed to sink for a second, like a sigh that shouldn't exist. The entity tried to escape, but for the first time couldn't break through the wall. It was trapped there, huddled, deformed, its voice faltering like a broken radio. "He is mine," whispered the entity, in a mixture of all the voices it had stolen. The figure shook its head slowly, and the gesture was so human it sent chills down his spine. "He was never yours," replied a voice that didn't come from the physical world. It was deeper than sound, older than words. He heard the voice not with his ears, but with his bones. The entity let out a scream, but not a normal scream, a scream that seemed to be pulled from within her, as if her very presence were being ripped away layer by layer. And then she split. First, there was a silent explosion of shadow that swept across the ceiling. Then all the lights flickered at once, and the entity shattered into fragments that were gathered to a specific point in the air, like dust being sucked into an invisible vacuum. The figure gathered these fragments with the gesture of someone closing a hand, and when it finished, there was nothing left but the entity in the room. No imitated voice, no shadow out of place, no icy touch in the air. But the silence that remained was not natural. It was like the silence after a scream that no one heard. The figure turned to him, and it was only at that moment that it truly looked. And seeing it looking back was worse than any previous presence, because he realized it wasn't a human, nor a malevolent entity, nor something that wanted to invade his body. It was something that was there to prevent another presence from completely crossing over, something that seemed to exist between boundaries, something that saw right through him as if he were made of glass, something that studied him not to imitate, but to confirm. And the figure said, in the same voice that belonged to no language, "She only managed to speak to you because you answered first." He fell to his knees. He didn't know what that meant. How could he have answered first? The figure continued, approaching without making a sound. "Next time, say nothing. Think nothing. Acknowledge nothing." He tried to ask, "Next time," but the figure was already dissolving, like smoke that leaves no smell, like a shadow that leaves no trace. Before disappearing completely, it left only one last sentence. "She didn't imitate your voice. She imitated your fear." And it vanished. That night, the house remained completely silent, heavy silence, the silence of a place that still holds something within its walls. He lay on the sofa, too afraid to get up, and stared at the dark hallway until sunrise. And just as the sky cleared, his cell phone vibrated on the table, An audio notification, a voice file sent by himself. Time 3:17 a.m. Duration 6 seconds. He pressed play with a trembling hand and heard his own voice say, "I'll find you first. Now tell me, have you ever heard your voice when you knew you weren't speaking?" Comment below. I want to know if it's ever happened to you or if it's the first time it's trying.